Hello everyone, I am in a Chuck E. Cheese, and I just got done playing in the ball pit. And like everyone else that plays in the ball pit, I caught a cold. I've put off recording this video for over a week, but the cold still isn't leaving. So, sorry my voice sounds like this, but I need to record this video to feed the algorithm. We've all played video games. You're weird if you haven't. When we think of video games today, we think of the Switch from Nintendo, the Xbox from Microsoft, or the PlayStation from Sony. Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony have been the biggest competitors of home consoles for the past 2.5 decades. But it wasn't always like that. There used to be others, like Atari and Sega. I'm sure you've heard those names before. Today, I am talking about Atari, the company that started it all. And no, that is not an exaggeration. The story of Atari is a Shakespearean tragedy. They once were at the top of the industry, but in a matter of a few years it all crashed and burned, faster than you can say 5200. Unlike most things, it begins in Utah. 1971. Nolan Bushnell is enrolled in an electrical engineering program at the University of Utah. Just like the kids of today, he was also obsessed with video games. However, in 1971 there wasn't much selection for him, and his game of choice was Space War. He would sneak into the college's computer lab to play it. And when I say computer lab, I literally mean the computer filled the whole lab. He also worked at an amusement park arcade that used coin-operated pinball machines and slot machines. Ted Dabney, software engineer and friend of Bushnell's that introduced him to Space War, would work with Bushnell to create their first game. They developed the first ever coin-operated video game called Computer Space. While too complex to take off commercially, it did provide $500 in royalties for them to found Syzygy Co. Turns out, Syzygy was already in use, so they changed the name to Atari. The name derives from the Japanese word ataru, which means good fortune, or that a good move is about to be made. In the next year, 1972, Magnavox would release the Odyssey. The Odyssey had a collection of silent video games, one of which was called Table Tennis. Do you see where this is going? This inspired Bushnell to hire engineer Al Alcorn, who had never programmed a computer game before. Bushnell gave Alcorn a test project. He told him it was for GE, which was a lie. Alcorn made the game and even added sound. This game was none other than Pong. Pong was different from other tennis-like games because the ball sped up as the game went on. Pong debuted in a California bar called Andy Capp. Within a week, the owner told Bushnell the game broke, and when Bushnell inspected it, he found it had been overloaded with coins. Atari made immense profits on Pong. Each unit cost $600 to make, and they sold for $1,100. Pong upgraded from just arcades to hotels and airports. Atari lit the match that ignited the whole video game industry. It was at this time Dabney left Atari after alienation from Bushnell. Dabney's biggest contribution was creating the video positioning technology that made Pong possible. Atari would go on to create home versions that hooked up to televisions. And in 1974, this resulted in a lawsuit from the one and only Magnavox. They sued Atari and other companies for infringing on their patent. They settled out of court for some money and for Atari to license the patent from Magnavox. During this period, they would hire a freshly graduated college student named Steve Jobs. Allegedly, Jobs had pitched the idea of starting a personal computer firm to Bushnell, but he declined. If only he knew he could have been a co-founder of Apple. In 1975, Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. 15 of which was paid to Bushnell for his share. As part of this deal, Bushnell would still remain head of the company, but was ultimately working at Warner's command. Why did he do it? Well, Atari had just finished developing the Atari VCS, later being renamed to the Atari 2600. Competition was entering the field, including ColecoVision and a small Japanese company that will probably never amount to anything called Nintendo. Atari was having cash flow problems trying to get the funds to mass produce the 2600. Warner had the money he needed. He wanted to dominate the fast-growing competition in the industry. Things at Atari were pretty lax, and Warner didn't like that. Bushnell threw many parties where certain substances were often involved. Bushnell believed the parties were constructive to their work, and creativity was valued above all else. The difference in ideals ultimately led to Bushnell being canned. Probably the most interesting fact of this entire video is that Bushnell went on to found another, arguably more famous company, Chuck E. Cheese. Bushnell was replaced by Ray Kazar. Kazar had spent most of his life working in the textiles industry. In other words, he knew nothing about computers. One of the first things Kazar did was increase the marketing budget to intentionally decrease the research and development budget. He did this to break the lackadaisical spirits of the employees. Kazar despised the environment Bushnell had created. calling the workers high-strung prima donnas. The workers responded by wearing shirts featuring an opera singer with the text, "I'm another high-strung prima donna from Atari." Kazar ruled Atari like Darth Vader, even gaining the nickname the Tsar. Kazar's management resulted in lots of talent leaving. 4 of the programmers that left were Bob Whitehead, David Crane, Alan Miller, and Larry Kaplan. They had read that the Atari games they had worked on were some of the best-selling in the industry. They felt mistreated because of how much revenue those games brought in. They went to Kazar and demanded to be treated like an artist, and that they receive royalties for their games, just as a musician would for songs. According to Kaplan, Kazar dismissed them, calling them towel designers, and that they were a dime a dozen. Kazar said they were not unique, and that anyone could make a cartridge. The 4 men went on to found Activision, one of the most successful video game publishers. Activision would go on to produce some of the most popular games for the Atari 2600. Atari was at its peak between 1978 and 1982, which also happened to be the worst years internally. The sales were from the Atari 2600. The Atari 2600 was probably the most important console in video game history, as it founded the industry. It was almost the first to have easily changeable cartridges. It was superior to single-game consoles like Pong for that reason alone. Sales only exploded after Atari obtained the rights to port Space Invaders in 1980. Space Invaders boosted Atari to 2 million sales that year, and in 2 more years, in 1982, sales would increase to 10 million. Not long, however, Atari would begin to decline. Bad third-party games were entering the market, some even racist and pornographic. I would like to show them here and just pixelate them for you, but they're already pixelated, and I would get age restricted, so I'm not going to show them. Atari contributed to the bad games as well, creating a Pac-Man port that was terrible. It sold simply because of the brand name, but the game was just awful. The developer was only given 6 weeks to work on it. Sounds like an early version of shovelware. Atari struck a deal with Steven Spielberg to make a tie-in E.T. game. Atari promised Spielberg $25 million in royalties. There was pressure to release it quickly before Christmas. The game was terrible. Kazar even opposed the deal, but it was pushed through anyway. If that isn't telling, I don't know what is. The game was confusing, bad, ugly, bad, confusing, bad, ugly. Did I mention it was bad? The public despised the game. This dragged Atari's reputation through the gutter. Atari lost $310 million in 1983, the E.T. game being a large chunk of that. The demand had dropped so dramatically that Atari buried 14 truckloads of cartridges in a New Mexico landfill. This once was a rumor, but has been proven true. So as Atari crashed and burned, it took the entire video game industry with it. During the video game industry crash, Atari released the 5200. It was a terrible flop. It was more powerful than the 2600 and the competition, but was scrutinized for the poorly designed controllers. Nintendo entered the scene and completely revived the gaming industry, but Atari was still suffering. The financials were so bad that Warner sold a large portion of assets to Commodore founder Jack Trammell's company, Trammell Technology. The company was now pretty much split in two. Warner retained the arcade portion, and Trammell's portion became known as Atari Corporation. Warner eventually sold their arcade portion to Namco. Under Trammell's Atari Corporation, they released the Atari 7800, a previously scrapped project. The 7800 was better than the 5200 in every way. It fixed the controller problem, and it had backwards compatibility with the 2600 games. This was a huge reason for its success. The next system that was released was the Atari XEGS. It worked as both a gaming system and a home computer. This system failed due to the overwhelming competition of the NES and Sega Master System. After this failure, they switched their direction to computers. They released the Atari ST, a 16-bit PC with 32-bit internals. This sold decently well. It funded their next project, the Atari Lynx. In 1988, Atari would make a stupid decision. But I guess at this point, that's what they're known for. They sued Nintendo for an illegal monopoly of the market. More on this soon. In 1989, Atari released the Lynx, the first color handheld. This same year, Nintendo released the Game Boy, another handheld. On paper, the Game Boy was worse in most ways. In theory, the Lynx should have sold better, but due to stocking limitations, Nintendo had the market, rendering the Lynx a failure. During this time, Nintendo would also respond to the lawsuit by a countersuit for infringing on their copyright. Without getting into tons of legal mumbo-jumbo, Nintendo essentially won. Atari had to pay Nintendo, but Nintendo admitted to wrongdoing without actually admitting to it. The important thing to take away from this is that it was a really stupid move on Atari's part. In 1993, Atari releases the Atari Jaguar. Any guesses how this one ends up? Despite having better hardware than the competition, the SNES and Sega's Master Drive, it still failed. It wasn't all bad. It did have a few good games, like Alien vs. Predator, Rayman, and, well, anyway, it was discontinued in 1996. It wasn't going to stand a chance against the N64, so it pretty much just gave up. 1996 to present day. I know this is a 28-year gap, but these past 3 decades haven't been too eventful for Atari. I will briefly go over it because it's just boring business stuff. In 1998, Hasbro snatched up the Atari brand for $5 million. A bunch of unimportant name changes happened, and then in 2013, they filed for bankruptcy after losing tens of millions of dollars every year since 2005. And that's where our story ends. Atari is currently looking for a new buyer, but I don't think anyone is stupid enough to buy it. There is a common consensus that Atari truly died with the 2600, and I'd have to agree. Now they are just a laughingstock of the gaming industry. I mean, how can you not be when you create a device called Touch Me? No thanks.